3 days before Christmas, I woke up feeling hollow. Not sad in a dramatic, cinematic way, just empty. Like someone had quietly removed something essential from my chest and left the space untouched. Both my parents had died that year. My mother in June, my father in September. 2 funerals, 2 goodbyes, and then silence. The house felt wrong without them. No Christmas music humming in the background, no smell of cookies or cinnamon drifting from the kitchen, no familiar chaos, just still air and rooms that echoed when I walked through them. I had retired in March after 40 years as an auditor. 40 years of reading numbers the way other people read faces, catching inconsistencies, following trails others assumed were invisible. I'd made a career out of proving that secrets always leave fingerprints. I was good at it. Painfully good. That morning, I went into my study to pull out old holiday decorations. I told myself I'd set up the model train for when my grandchildren visited. Something familiar, something grounding. That's when I found it. A burgundy notebook shoved deep into the back of a drawer. My husband's handwriting filled the pages. I didn't think much of it when I opened it. I assumed it was work notes or lists or reminders. Page 1 stopped my breath. Why does she always breathe so loud? Page 3. Those ugly brown cardigans make her look pathetic. Page 6. No one wants to hear about her boring job. I kept turning pages. 57 entries in total. I counted them twice. These weren't fleeting thoughts. These were things he'd said to me out loud at our daughter's birthday party, at Thanksgiving dinners, at neighborhood barbecues. He'd humiliated me publicly, then come home and acted like nothing was wrong. The notebook wasn't a diary. It was a record, a private inventory of how he saw me. And suddenly, everything made sense. The way he spoke to me when other people were watching. The way his laughter sharpened when I tried to contribute. The way I'd started shrinking without realizing it. I stood there in my silent house, holding proof that my marriage hadn't been eroding quietly. It had been dismantled, deliberately. That was the moment I understood something terrifying and clarifying all at once. This wasn't about love fading. This was about contempt. And contempt leaves trails. I had spent my entire career following them. I just hadn't realized the most important audit of my life was my own marriage. Not yet, but I was about to. I was 62 years old when I finally admitted the truth to myself. My marriage hadn't collapsed suddenly. It had been hollowed out slowly, carefully, over years. I had built my life on structure, on discipline, on understanding how systems worked and how they failed. I became an auditor because numbers made sense to me when people didn't. Numbers didn't charm you. They didn't gaslight you. They didn't pretend to be one thing while quietly doing another. I met my husband Daniel when I was 29. He was charming in an effortless way, the kind of man who filled rooms without raising his voice. He worked in corporate operations back then, ambitious, polished, already convinced he was meant for bigger things. He liked that I was intelligent, or at least he liked saying he did. I liked that he made decisions quickly. After years of second-guessing myself, his confidence felt like safety. We married 2 years later. I don't remember the proposal being dramatic. There was no grand gesture, no audience. He gave me a simple ring and said something about stability, about building something solid together. At the time, that sounded like love. We built a life that looked good on paper. A house in a quiet neighborhood. A daughter, Emma, who arrived after years of trying. Careers that paid the bills and impressed the right people. From the outside, we were steady, respectable, functional. Inside, the imbalance started early. I carried the emotional logistics, remembered birthdays, managed holidays, smoothed conflicts. I earned well, but I never made it about power. Daniel liked that. He liked that I never made him feel small. Somewhere along the way, that became expected. Daniel's career accelerated. Promotions, titles, invitations to events where spouses were accessories, not participants. I noticed when conversations shifted, how my comments were brushed past, how his colleagues spoke over me once they realized I wasn't useful to their networking goals. Daniel didn't defend me. At first, I told myself he didn't notice. Then I realized he did, and didn't care. The jokes started as teasing. Then they sharpened. He mocked my clothes, my routines, my way of speaking about work. He'd roll his eyes when I mentioned audits or compliance, like I was talking about something vaguely embarrassing. "You still do that?" he once asked at a dinner party, laughing. People laughed with him. I laughed too. Because that's what you do when you don't want to be the problem. Emma noticed before I did. She was 16 when she first asked why her father and I slept in separate rooms. I told her I snored. She didn't believe me, but she let it go. She was already learning what it meant to read between the lines. Daniel's family never liked me much. They thought I was too quiet, too serious, not decorative enough. His sister, Jennifer, treated me like furniture, useful, ignorable. I absorbed it all the way I absorbed everything else, silently, professionally. I told myself marriages changed, that long-term partnerships settled into something less romantic, but more durable. What I didn't want to admit was this: Daniel wasn't settling. He was checking out. And while I was maintaining the structure of our life, he was already investing elsewhere. I just hadn't followed the trail yet. But habits die hard. And once you've trained yourself to notice patterns, it's almost impossible to stop. The first thing that changed wasn't his schedule. It was his tone. Daniel had always been busy. Long hours were normal in our world. Late meetings, early flights, calendars that filled themselves. I'd lived alongside that rhythm for decades without complaint. But this was different. His patience thinned, not explosively. Daniel wasn't a man who lost control, but surgically. Conversations shortened, responses flattened. When I spoke, his eyes drifted, like he was already somewhere else. And when he did listen, it felt evaluative, like I was being measured and found lacking. He started correcting me in public. It happened often enough that people stopped looking at me when I spoke. At home, he withdrew into his phone, screen angled away, notifications silenced. If I asked who he was texting, he didn't snap. He laughed. "Work," he'd say. Always work. I noticed the excuses before I noticed the evidence. Charity dinners he couldn't quite describe. Strategy sessions that ran late but produced nothing tangible. Events he claimed were exhausting, but never seemed to include the people he named. I didn't confront him. That's the part people misunderstand about women like me. They think silence means ignorance, or fear, or weakness. Sometimes it just means data collection hasn't finished yet. Daniel's sister Jennifer became suddenly interested in my life. She asked questions that felt rehearsed, about our finances, about retirement, about whether I planned to slow down now that I wasn't working full-time. When I told her I was still consulting privately, she smiled too widely. "Oh," she said, "I thought you were done." The word lingered. Done. Daniel's colleagues started treating me like a background fixture. At holiday parties, his boss, Marcia, laughed a little too hard at Daniel's jokes and barely acknowledged me at all. When I spoke, conversations shifted around me. Once, I caught Daniel watching that happen. He didn't step in. He didn't even look uncomfortable. That was when the unease settled in my chest. Not panic, not jealousy. Something colder. Recognition. I checked our shared accounts out of habit. Nothing dramatic, just small inconsistencies. Expenses filed oddly. Charges that didn't align with explanations. I didn't accuse. I logged. Uber rides I didn't recognize. Hotel charges buried under corporate reimbursements. Dinners billed as client development with no client attached. Individually, they were nothing. Together, they formed a shape. Daniel started coming home later, smelling different. Not perfume, he was careful, but champagne, soap that wasn't ours. He'd shower immediately, like he needed to erase something before speaking to me. One night, he came home after midnight, flushed and distracted, still wearing his jacket. "Long strategy session," he said, loosening his tie. I helped him get ready for bed. the way I always had. Covered him with the quilt, turned off the light. Then I went to my computer. Old instincts surfaced easily. I created a spreadsheet. Dates, times, amounts, approval names. I labeled the folder Q for projections. No one ever looked at those. The thing about emotional misuse is that once someone decides you're checked out, they assume you're blind. Daniel thought retirement had softened me, that grief had dulled my edge, that I was too tired to notice. He didn't realize that grief had stripped away my tolerance for nonsense, and retirement hadn't made me passive. It had made me available. I wasn't angry yet. I was curious. And curiosity, when paired with patience, is dangerous. The night everything crystallized was ordinary in the most dangerous way. Daniel told me he'd be attending a literacy charity event downtown. He even showed me the flyer, glossy paper, tasteful font, sponsors listed neatly at the bottom. He wore a dark suit I liked, one he rarely chose on his own. Said he'd be home late, kissed my cheek like it was muscle memory. I watched him leave and felt nothing sharp enough to name. That unsettled me more than suspicion ever could. I spent the evening alone, the house quiet, in a way I was learning to tolerate. Around midnight, Daniel came home. He looked tired but not drained, vague when I asked how it went. Food was bad, he said, shrugging. Some weird entertainment. Everyone was uncomfortable. It sounded rehearsed. The next morning, I opened my laptop out of habit. Not suspicion, habit. 40 years will do that to you. I checked quarterly reports the way some people check the weather. That's when I saw it. A reimbursement filed under Marcia's name. Dinner at Giovanni's, $260. Approved at 11:42 p.m. The date stopped me cold. September 19th. The same night, Daniel had been at a literacy charity event. Giovanni's wasn't near the venue listed on the flyer. It was downtown, upscale, reservations required. Seafood-heavy menu Daniel hated. 2 entrees, wine, dessert, not a solo meal. I didn't confront him, not yet. That afternoon, I mentioned it casually, the way you'd comment on a coincidence. Funny thing, I said, not looking up from my coffee. Marcia had dinner at Giovanni's the same night as your event. Daniel barely glanced up from his phone. Oh, he said, that was me, work stuff. The dismissal was effortless. That was the moment something inside me shifted. Not anger. Alignment. I printed the reimbursement, cross-referenced it with corporate logs, checked approval chains. Everything matched. Clean. Too clean. So I started documenting properly. Not thoughts. Not feelings. Facts. Every expense Daniel filed under Marcia's authorization, I printed. Every time Daniel said he was somewhere and records suggested otherwise, I logged it. GPS metadata, email headers, keycard access logs. You'd be surprised what information is accessible if you know where to look, and who still owes you favors. One night, Daniel came home close to 2 a.m., flushed, distracted, smelling like champagne and unfamiliar soap. Said he'd been at a breakthrough strategy session. I helped him into bed, tucked him in, kissed his forehead. Then I opened my spreadsheet. Room service at Riverside Suites, $96. Time-stamped, 12:47 a.m. Approved under Executive Hospitality. Marcia again. I emailed Marcia's assistant the next morning requesting updated quarterly reports. Got them within an hour. Page 6. Cross-referenced. I printed 2 copies. One went into my Q4 file. The other went into a sealed envelope with Emma's name on it. She was 16 then, already asking why her father and I slept apart. I told her I snored. She didn't believe me. I handed her the envelope. Don't open this, I said gently, unless things get really confusing or someone tries to change the story. She nodded. She looked scared. I hated that. But lies spread like mold. If you don't contain them, everything rots. By December, Daniel thought I'd gone soft. His lawyer thought I was an easy target. Marcia thought she was untouchable. They were all wrong. I decided to come home 3 days before Christmas, a day earlier than expected. A 6-hour drive. No music. no calls, just numbers, dates, clauses, account identifiers. The prenuptial trust agreement we'd signed 30 years ago. The amendment Daniel never bothered to read. When I pulled into the driveway, there were 7 cars parked outside. And that's when I knew this wasn't a conversation. It was an ambush. I sat in my car for a moment longer than necessary, hands resting on the steering wheel, engine ticking as it cooled. 7 cars. Daniel's, Emma's, Jennifer's ridiculous green SUV. A black Mercedes with out-of-state plates I recognized from traffic camera screenshots near the Riverside Suites. 3 others, likely rentals. Through the front window, I could see people inside. Not a party, no laughter, no movement that suggested celebration. There were folders on the coffee table, wine glasses filled but untouched, bodies positioned too carefully. This wasn't emotion. This was choreography. I picked up the bag of Christmas gifts I'd wrapped weeks earlier. Matching pajamas for everyone, names embroidered. I'd even gotten a set for the dog. There was nothing for Daniel. Not anymore. When I opened the door, the room fell silent. Daniel stood by the fireplace in a dark suit, hair perfect. Too perfect. His smile arrived a half-second too late. That delay told me everything. Marcia stood beside him, hands folded, posture rehearsed, confident but not relaxed. Her eyes flicked to the briefcase in my hand, then away. Emma was halfway down the stairs, frozen. She wasn't supposed to be there. She was meant to be in Vermont until Christmas Eve. That was my first crack of pain. "Claire, you're just in time," Daniel said, voice light, artificial. "We need you to sign a few things." A stack of documents appeared in his hands, professionally bound, heavy, final. His lawyer, Patterson, stood near the dining table. My lawyer, Wilson, was in the corner, shoulders slumped, already defeated. He wouldn't meet my eyes. That told me he'd been outplayed. "Sign what?" I asked. Daniel smiled the way people do when they think they're being generous. "With everything going on," he said, "we thought it would be best to finalize the divorce before the holidays get complicated." The word finalize landed softly, like a blade padded with velvet. Patterson stepped forward with a pen. "Everything's been reviewed, nothing unexpected." He still wouldn't look at me. Jennifer leaned against the hallway wall, tablet in hand, smirking. Her arms were crossed tightly, but her fingers shook. She was nervous. That amused me. Emma came down the stairs slowly. "I thought you weren't coming until tomorrow," she whispered. "Change of plans," I said quietly. Then, louder to the room, "Is anyone going to offer me a drink?" Marcia laughed, too loudly. "Let's handle the formalities first. Then we can toast to new beginnings." Her eyes lingered on Daniel in a way that wasn't subtle. I took the pen, turned it in my fingers. Daniel watched me like a man holding his breath. "You always hated surprises," I said calmly. He blinked. "What?" I clicked the pen. "You're going to love this one." And I signed. Not their documents. Mine. The confusion rippled instantly. Marcia's confident expression cracked. Patterson cleared his throat. Jennifer squinted at the signature page like she'd missed something crucial. I handed the pen back, opened my briefcase, and placed my own folder on the table. Professionally bound, notarized, sealed over a month ago. "This," I said, "is the legal version." Daniel's smile twitched. "This isn't the same document." "No," I said. "This one is actually binding." The room shifted. Patterson leaned in, face draining of color. "This was notarized a month ago," he said slowly. "How?" I looked at him with the disappointment of a teacher whose student hadn't read the footnotes. "Because your client doesn't read disclosure schedules," I said. "But I do." Silence. Real silence. The kind that hums. Daniel looked at Marcia. Marcia looked at Patterson. Jennifer's smirk vanished. I hadn't raised my voice. I hadn't accused anyone. I had simply changed the rules of the room, and they were only just beginning to realize it. The air in the room thickened the way it does right before a storm. Heavy, electric, waiting for something to break. Daniel reached for the folder I'd placed on the table, then hesitated, as if touching it might burn him. His fingers hovered, uncertain for the first time in years. "This version doesn't include the revised property distributions," he said carefully. The addendums, the real estate carve-outs. I stayed seated. That's because those were never legally binding, I replied. We never signed them. Patterson flipped through the pages faster now, panic replacing professionalism. This document references an irrevocable prenuptial trust, he said, amended 4 months ago under Article 3. Jennifer leaned forward. What trust? I met her eyes. The one paying the mortgage on the lake house you've been living in since April. Her mouth opened. Closed. I froze it last week, I added. Keep the towels, though. They were a wedding gift. Marcia cleared her throat, stepping forward as if authority were something she could still summon on command. Claire, she said gently, perhaps there's been a misunderstanding. I turned to her slowly. You authorized 3 corporate expense reports for client dinners with my husband at Giovanni's, I said. I have receipts, security footage timestamps, and reservation confirmations, all under your name. Her lips parted, then pressed together. I don't remember authorizing. I know, I said calmly, but you did, or at least your login did. I reached into my briefcase and placed a small black package on the table, wrapped plainly, no ribbon. A gift, I said. Open it before you say anything else. Marcia unwrapped it carefully. Inside were 2 flash drives nestled in foam. One red, one silver, each labeled neatly. Red is the audit trail, I said. 18 months of transactions, misclassified reimbursements, hotel suites, 1 spa entry approved on a Sunday. I tapped the silver drive. Compliance logs, keycard entries, IP addresses, calendar screenshots, cross-referenced. Her face drained of color. Why would you have these? She whispered. Because I know the difference between coincidence and corruption. Daniel's breathing turned shallow. Marcia swallowed. You can't prove intent. I smiled. Not kindly, not cruelly. I don't have to. You're a senior executive with sloppy compliance controls and a personal relationship with a beneficiary tied to an open trust. The appearance of impropriety alone triggers an external audit. She stared at me like someone watching a tidal wave approach. Why now? She asked. Because I was tired of being polite. Phones began buzzing. Not mine. Jennifer's tablet vibrated in her hands. She stared at the screen, then at me. Patterson's phone followed, then Marcia's. She answered hers, voice barely steady. Marcia here? A pause. Yes. Another pause. Longer. Her eyes widened. External auditors? She repeated. Tonight? Silence swallowed the room. Daniel looked between us, confusion collapsing into fear. What documentation? He demanded. You'll see, I said. The board received the compliance package this morning. Marcia ended the call slowly, her hand trembling. She sank into the armchair like a woman losing altitude mid-flight. They served us, she said hoarsely. Conflict of interest review. Immediate suspension pending investigation. Jennifer sat down without another word. Patterson backed away from the table, sweat forming at his temples. This could implicate multiple parties. Good, I said quietly. Daniel finally lost his composure. You waited years just to destroy everything? I met his gaze, steady. No, I said. I waited to see how far you'd go. Another buzz. Marcia's phone lit up again. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The collapse wasn't loud. It was procedural, methodical, unstoppable. And as the room filled with overlapping voices, accusations, denials, panic, I realized something with surprising clarity. I wasn't escalating. I was closing the books. For all the precision, all the preparation, I hadn't accounted for the sound, not shouting. Not the sharpness of panic, but the low, broken static of people realizing the story they'd rehearsed no longer mattered. Jennifer was yelling at Patterson now, words tumbling over each other, malpractice, sabotage, betrayal. Daniel paced near the fireplace, jacket discarded, hair no longer perfect. Marcia sat hunched in the armchair, phone loose in her hand, staring at the screen like it might explain itself. I stood very still, because this was the moment people assume power feels good. It didn't. It felt heavy. Emma had disappeared upstairs sometime during the chaos. I hadn't seen her leave. The realization hit me suddenly, painfully. I found her in the hallway later, curled on the bottom step, knees drawn to her chest. 18 years old in an oversized hoodie, hair tangled, face pale. She looked so small. "I wasn't supposed to be here," she whispered when she saw me. "Mom said you didn't want to come anymore." I sat beside her, careful not to crowd her. The hardwood was cold beneath us. "She told me you were tired," Emma continued, staring at her hands, "that you wanted out, that you were willing to sign everything over just to be free." I didn't interrupt. Then she looked up at me. "But I saw the video." My heart slowed. "The one you left on my phone," she said, "hidden in the Florida photos folder." I had hoped she'd find it, just not like this. "You weren't supposed to see it yet," I said softly. "I know," she replied, "but I needed to understand." She swallowed hard. "You showed the spreadsheets," she continued. "You explained everything. And then the footage." I closed my eyes briefly. "The hotel," she said. "Mom walking into the suite, Marcia signing the room service receipt, the timestamp." Her voice broke. "You said you weren't angry," she whispered, "that you were sad, that you weren't going to scream or fight because you didn't deserve that." I took her hand, gently. "You said you were still my mom no matter what happened," she continued, tears slipping free now. "Even if Dad tried to make me believe otherwise." That broke something in me I hadn't realized was still intact. Because in all my planning, all my restraint, all my quiet execution, I'd nearly forgotten the one person this could wound the most. "I never wanted you to carry this," I said, "but I couldn't let you grow up believing a lie about me." She nodded. "I know." We sat there in the quiet, breathing through it together, while voices echoed faintly downstairs. "I hate how he talks about you," Emma said suddenly. "Like you're just someone who writes checks." I smiled faintly. "To be fair, I did write a lot of checks." She shook her head. "You showed up, even when he didn't want you to." That was the lowest point, not the betrayal. Not the ambush. The realization that no matter how cleanly you document the truth, it still hurts the people you're trying to protect. I squeezed her hand. "You don't have to go back down there." She nodded. "I don't want to." "You don't have to," I said. "They've already lost the only thing that mattered." She didn't ask what that was. She already knew. When I walked back into the living room, the atmosphere had curdled. Not rage, panic. Jennifer had abandoned yelling and moved on to frantic texting, her tablet clutched to her chest like a shield. Patterson sat stiffly at the dining table, eyes darting between his phone and the documents, calculating how much of this could still land on him. Daniel stood near the window, staring out at nothing, jaw clenched so tightly I could see the muscle twitch. He hadn't looked at me since Emma left the stairs. Marcia was the only one still seated, hunched forward, elbows on her knees, phone in one hand, the other pressed to her temple. The black box with the flash drives was still in her coat pocket. She didn't need to open it. She already knew. Another vibration broke the silence. Marcia unlocked her phone, read a line, then another. Her lips parted slightly, as if she were trying to breathe through water. She tilted the screen toward me, not toward them. "Contract suspended," she read softly. "All investigations tied to Claire's disclosure. Do not speak publicly." The room went dead quiet. Jennifer's tablet slipped from her hands and clattered onto the floor. "Daniel," I folded my hands in front of me. No anger, no triumph. "I checked the receipts," I said. He frowned, not understanding. "I checked them when your quarterly filings didn't match reimbursement reports," I continued. "When your calendar showed back-to-back client meetings in hotels with no clients listed. When my name appeared in 3 procurement memos while you told me you were reorganizing closets." Marcia flinched. "When you listed me as a consulting asset without declaring the conflict," I added. "When trust funds were redirected to cover business liabilities without disclosure." Daniel took a step back. "You mistook my silence for ignorance," I said. "But silence is just the audit before the report." Patterson stood abruptly. "You filed a fraud report against your own spouse?" I shook my head. "I submitted a request for audit. The determination isn't mine to make." Jennifer stared at me like I'd struck her. Marcia's phone buzzed again. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. "You didn't just go after me," she said hoarsely. "You went after the entire infrastructure." "No," I said. "You brought me into it. I just turned on the lights." That was the turning point. Not when they realized they'd lost control, but when they understood this wasn't emotional. It was procedural, irreversible. Daniel's voice cracked. "You planned this." I met his eyes fully for the first time that night. "No," I said quietly. "You wrote it. I just proofread." I walked to the fireplace and picked up the documents Daniel had expected me to sign. The ones meant to strip me quietly, efficiently, cleanly. I folded them once, twice, then placed them into the fire. No one stopped me. No one dared. Because the heat in that room wasn't coming from the flames. It came from comprehension. They hadn't trapped me. They'd walked into a system that had already closed around them. The collapse didn't happen all at once. It unraveled. Quietly, methodically. The way systems fail when every safeguard turns out to be cosmetic. Phones kept buzzing. Short, sharp vibrations that no one wanted to answer. Jennifer's earlier fury dissolved into frantic whispers as she paced near the kitchen, arguing with someone on the line about titles, deeds, access codes. Every few seconds, she glanced toward me like I might revoke gravity itself. Patterson stopped pretending he was representing anyone. He sat apart now, hunched over his phone, typing rapidly, deleting, typing again. He wasn't thinking about Daniel anymore. He was thinking about liability. Marcia hadn't moved. She sat in the armchair, shoulders slumped, staring at the floor like it might open and swallow her. The woman who used to command rooms with a smile and a handshake now looked reduced to a line item. Daniel hovered in the middle of it all, hands opening and closing, searching for something. Control, maybe, or forgiveness. He found neither. "This is fixable," he said at last, voice too loud, too forced. "We can still talk. We can still—" "No," Marcia interrupted quietly. Everyone froze. Marcia lifted her head slowly, eyes hollow. "It's not." She turned to Daniel, not angry, resigned. "They've frozen discretionary authority. HR is involved, legal's involved, the board's involved. This isn't a misunderstanding." Jennifer stopped pacing. "What does that mean?" "It means," Marcia said, "I'm radioactive." Silence again. Daniel's face crumpled, not dramatically, but inwardly, like a structure failing internally before the cracks show. "What about us?" he asked me, finally. I looked at him. Really looked. At the man who'd mocked me publicly, dismissed me privately, underestimated me professionally. The man who thought contempt was invisible, if delivered with a smile. "There is no us left to discuss," I said. "Only consequences." I picked up the bag of Christmas gifts and placed them neatly by the couch. Emma's name, mine, even one for the dog. None for Daniel. That absence spoke louder than anything else I could have said. Jennifer noticed it too. Her eyes flicked to the floor, then away. One by one, they began to realize what was gone. Not just money, not just reputation, but narrative. They could no longer control the story. Daniel's phone rang. He answered, listened, his face drained. "What do you mean access revoked?" he whispered. "It's my account." He lowered the phone slowly. "They've frozen the joint accounts," he said, looking at me like this was a revelation. I nodded. "That happens when fiduciary breaches intersect with marital trusts." Marcia stood unsteadily, adjusting her coat. "I should go." No one stopped her. No one offered help. As she reached the door, she paused, turned back to me. "You didn't have to do it this way." I met her gaze calmly. "I did." She left. Jennifer followed soon after, muttering into her phone, heels clicking too fast, dignity abandoned somewhere near the hallway. Patterson gathered his papers silently and slipped out, already drafting statements in his head. That left Daniel alone. He stood there, surrounded by the ruins of a plan that had relied on my silence. "I never thought you'd do this," he said quietly. "I know," I replied. That was the problem. I didn't wait for his response. I walked to the door, paused only long enough to glance back at the house, the life I'd maintained long after it stopped sustaining me. Then I stepped outside. I didn't slam the door. I didn't look back. The final insult was how gently I left. The air outside was sharp and clean, the kind of cold that wakes you up without asking permission. I stood on the porch for a moment, listening. Behind me, muffled voices rose and fell, arguments losing their shape, panic chasing itself in circles. Phones rang, doors opened and closed. Somewhere inside, a life I had outgrown was finally collapsing under its own weight. I didn't feel victorious. I felt finished. I walked down the steps without a coat, without a suitcase. I hadn't brought one. There was nothing left inside that belonged to me. At the gate, my phone buzzed. Right on time. A private account. One Daniel didn't know existed. Created years ago through a legal firm in another state. Quiet, secure, patient. Subject, termination confirmed. Attached were the files I'd already reviewed a dozen times. Timelines, PDFs, audit trails, audio logs, tax cross-references. Every document clean, time-stamped, corroborated. The kind of package no executive can explain away. I didn't need to write a message. The attachment said everything. As I closed the gate behind me, I heard Daniel's voice carry through the cold air, confused, cracked, asking questions that no longer had answers. I didn't turn around. I kept walking. Down the street, past houses glowing with early Christmas lights, past wreaths and snow-dusted lawns. Ordinary lives continuing, uninterrupted. I thought about my parents, about the year I'd lost them, about how grief had stripped me down to essentials, what mattered, what didn't, what I would no longer tolerate. I thought about Emma, about truth, about how silence isn't weakness. It's often preparation. I had spent decades auditing other people's lives, their systems, their lives. I hadn't realized I'd need to audit my own. Here's what I learned. Contempt is louder than anger, but easier to miss. People who underestimate you rely on your politeness to survive. And truth doesn't need theatrics. It only needs records. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I didn't explode. I checked the receipts. And when the books finally closed, I walked away with nothing in my hands and everything intact. Some endings are quiet, but they are absolute.